if you have any questions or whatever.
Okay.
So in this session, we're going to talk a little bit about why you might think about using clickers, or more generally, polling software. And there we go. So what I was going to do is actually demonstrate this. And this is a small sample, but I'm going to open up the iClicker cloud software. And what would be good is if you could go to, let me find the site. This is something I meant to have ready.
All right.
If you could jump to this site, I'll put it in the chat.
Okay.
And just create a free account there, just to show you what it looks like from the student side. Or if you have an iPhone or an Android phone, you could download the iClicker app, the student app, either way.
Okay. I've got it on my laptop now here.
Okay.
Okay.
Now, what will happen is when you create an account, you get 2 weeks of use for free just to experiment with it, to see what it's like.
Okay.
And the same is true for students. So if you introduce polling, let me go back a step. There's a chance that the college may provide this using some of the some funds that have come in from the federal government. Hi, Janet. What we're going to do is we're going to start actually by having you look at clickers from the student side, and I'm going to demonstrate some of the things. So if you could click on the link that's in the chat and sign up for a free account, we're going to take you through some examples of how this might be used.
Do I need to create the account here, John?
You do. So you have to first create an account, give it your Oswego or your Oneonta email address, and
you say sign in?
Well, what you'll have to do actually is choose a create an account option.
Oh.
And then you'd sign in.
So in that create account box, what would I enter in there?
Let me see. What is it asking?
It just says find your
institution. So actually for both of you, just choose Oswego, and then it will show what institutions are available in Oswego. I already have one here. So it's in the Find My Institution box at the top. So if you type in, I'm doing it on my other screen. I'm sorry. But if you, let me drag that over.
I'll just watch. All right. Because.
Okay.
Okay.
So because I have a student account here too. So if you click SUNY College at Oswego, and then just say next, and then you fill out the information on it. And this is something that students have to do only once. And we've adopted a campus standard of iClicker actually about a decade ago. So that way students don't have to pay for it multiple times or sign up for it multiple times. Once they have an account set up, it will work in any class that's using iClicker.
Okay.
As long as they have an active account. Now, what we are hoping is that our Campus Technology Support Center will be paying for a site license for this summer, which will allow students to use it for free. I believe, Janet, at Oneonta, you have an agreement with Top Hat, which is, I think, the standard there. It's a very similar type of system in many ways. I think it's Top Hat at Oneonta.
I have no idea. Thanks.
Chilton could tell you.
I know.
Chilton or Ed or,
Right. So I've kind of lost your image and I can't sign in, but I'll just keep poking around and I can hear your voice. So life is good.
Okay. Well, if you want to get back to the Zoom screen, it's that little thing with a camera icon on the bottom of your screen.
Okay.
This thing right down here. And that should bring back the Zoom window.
All right. Don't worry about it. Thank you, John. I could be wandering for hours, but I can hear you.
So I just want to show you some of the things that could be done. And Jim, how's it going?
Okay, I'm on a screen that says iClicker Reef,
Okay.
and it's asking me for my email.
Okay. So then so you're logging in now? You're probably
Yeah.
logging in right now.
Yeah.
Okay. That would be the email you use and then whatever password you created.
Okay.
And this is something usually on the very first day of class for freshmen, I'll take the students through. When I have them in upper level classes, they've pretty much already done it because most economics classes have been using this for the last several years. It fell off a bit last year, but most students at least used it as freshmen. Because I think nearly all of us use it in our intro classes.
Okay, it's telling me remote registration. Are you using an iClicker remote?
No. The remote is a physical device, which it works with radio frequency, which only works in the classroom. That's where the term clicker was. You know, they were the physical clickers that you clicked on to indicate your responses that connected to a receiver at the front of the classroom. You can use them either with mobile devices on the web or as an iPhone or an Android app, or students could use a physical clicker in a physical classroom, but only if everyone's in the classroom.
I see.
So we mostly have moved to the remote use now.
Okay. It's just telling me now that I don't have any courses.
Okay, so then you should be able to search for my last name. If you just type in Kane, it should show the courses. And I created one just as a demo. I think it's called Test.
Okay.
John, I can't find the screen with your image. Nowhere near it. So I may sign out and try to sign in again.
You could, or if you go to, can you see the taskbar at the bottom of the screen?
No, it's all gone.
Okay, if you close the window that you open, if you close a web browser window that is currently open, it should be underneath that. Or if you click on minimize at the top of the screen, that little minus sign on the top right.
Right. So there's really nothing here that makes sense to me. So I think I'm going to have to sign out and sign in.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
No problem. We'll be here.
I'm on a screen, John, that says courses, profile, subscriptions, and sign out.
Click on courses.
Okay. Okay. And it says active 0. You don't have any courses.
And there should be a search for a class option.
I'm just not seeing that anyplace.
Is there a plus sign or something on the screen?
Yes, the plus sign.
Click on the plus sign.
Okay. And then, okay.
Then if you just search for my last name, Kane, you should be able to find.
Okay.
There should be a course and it should be listed as test. In the fall, all the classes I'm using with it would show up and you just, students would just select whichever class they're in.
Okay. Okay, so I just add this course then?
Yep.
Okay.
And then it will say that there is a course active or there is a session that's active.
Okay. It just says test.
Yes, click on that. And once you join that, and that's what students would do from once they're already connected, that any class that they have would be listed as their active courses. So when they go into class, they'd open the app up and they'd join that class session.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And now this little thing on my screen here, this cloud thing, is the toolbar that generates the questions. You create any questions right in whatever you're doing on the screen. It could be anything on the screen. It could, in this case, I'm using Google Slides. It could be PowerPoint. It could be a word processor. It could be anything. As long as there's some question on the screen that students can see, they can respond. Now, I click on that symbol, it expands out, and it gives me the option of the type of question. And I'm going to choose short answer here. And I'm going to click the play button to start the polling. And now what happens is you should see a box where you can respond to this. And you can type anything here. You should just type anything and click submit. And what will happen is I'll see the responses as they come in. When I do this in a class of like 300 or 400 students, I'll see the numbers jumping up really rapidly.
Wow.
And now there's one response. And so if Janet was connected, she could type something in and I'd see 2 responses there. So I'm going to stop the polling. And now what I can do is I can open the results panel and see what the answer was. Oh, I was playing with that before. Why am I not seeing it? Oh, there we go. Want to know how to do this. Okay, so that was your response. So normally, I had experimented with the numeric question right before the session, and that's why that was there. So this is your response. And if there were dozens of responses, you could scroll through the whole list. Now, if you're doing this with a class, you might have this window over on the other side where you could see it before you decide to share it with students, or you could do it right here if you want to see the results. So that's just an open-ended response question where you can get feedback from people. And if there are correct answers, you'll see all of them, and there may be some duplicates, and you just click on it, and that would be graded correct. And you could just go down and click them. And then students, if you're grading the results, would end up having a grade transferred over to their grade book. Okay, so I'll close this again and get it out of the way. It just hangs out on top of the screen. And if you have something you need to view, you just move it out of the way. So it basically, you create your presentation and questions right in whatever you normally would be using. And then it's there whenever you want to do polling. So, so now I'm going to jump to a little bit of a presentation, and we'll come back and look at more uses of this in just a second. One reason for using clickers is that it provides retrieval practice. And going back over a century now, it was an original, as you know, Jim, this was called the testing effect. It's there's been a tremendous amount of psychological research on how we learn. And one result that's been robust in pretty much every study that's ever been done is that practicing retrieving information is the most powerful way of encouraging people to learn material and to have long-term retention of concepts. And using clickers in class is a great way of using retrieval practice. You could start a class with it where you had students do some reading and then ask them some questions about it. You could give them some problems where they have to do some applications of things they've learned. You could give a short presentation and then you could ask some questions about what they just did or some application of that to test their ability to transfer the concepts into, and I'll try to stop hitting the microphone, into a new context. It's a really good way if you have large classes of adding some interactivity into the class, because lectures can be efficient in transferring knowledge, but students' interest and focus tends to fade pretty easily, and they tend not to learn as much or recall as much if you don't break it up and ask them some questions about it and do some retrieval practice right then. And it also gives them the ability to check their understanding. Students will often say that, they understood everything in class, but then they got to the test or an application and it didn't make sense. Here, this gives students a chance to check their understanding when it doesn't count very much or at all. You don't have to grade this, but what most people do is they provide a grade where there's some points for correct answers, but there's also some points for just responding, for participating in the activity. I know most people in the economics department will give, say, 3 points for any answer and 5 points for a correct answer. So even if they get everything wrong when they're trying it in class, they're going to get a 60% for that day's quizzing. Typically students might get half of them correct and half of them incorrect, because you generally want to ask challenging questions that will force students to engage with the question a bit more and wrestle with it, because that's where most of the learning tends to occur, when students are struggling to try to make connections. And it's giving them immediate feedback on whether they understand things before they get to a high stakes exams where it's going to be more costly to make mistakes. It also provides us with feedback. We get to see what students are understanding. We get to adjust what we're doing based on how well students respond to questions. If we see that everyone's, or 95% or so of the class, understands something, you don't need to spend a lot of time on it. You can just go over it briefly and then move on. But if you see that only 20% of the student was able to get a correct, of the students were able to get a correct answer, then you might want to go back and build that up a little bit more, scaffold the concepts a little bit more. So it's a really good way of giving everyone feedback on how students are learning, allowing us to use class time much more efficiently. It also breaks up attention and focus that, in a large, I often teach classes of 300 to 420, which is the capacity of room 101 in Lanigan. And, students can pretty easily get distracted in there and have some little side conversations, or just start browsing the web, or doing some shopping or something similar, or browsing Instagram. This brings them right back to focus, that it brings their attention back. And the interesting thing is, you do a clicker question, and as part of it, typically I'll have students first answer themselves, then discuss with people around them. The noise level gets really loud as everyone's talking about the issue. If I have TAs, they and I will be wandering around the classroom, assisting students when they're discussing it. Even without TAs, I'll be wandering around and doing it. And the classroom gets really noisy while students are actively discussing the question or the problem that they've been faced with. And then they come right back to focus. They quiet right back down as soon as they vote a second time, because they now want to know what the answer is. They've taken a stand, they've made a commitment, and they want to know if they're correct or not. And that activates their curiosity and builds more intrinsic motivation into the learning, because now they've committed to something. Dan Ariely, who's behavioral economist, psychologist, and so forth, noted that he'd give presentations where about a study where the results were not really terribly intuitive beforehand. But he'd give that presentation to businesses who had paid him to come in and talk to them about his research. And they'd say, well, yeah, that makes sense. That's exactly what we'd expect. So what he started doing is he started polling the people in the presentation before revealing the answer. So he'd tell them what the study was trying to find, and then he'd ask them to predict what was going to happen. And then that prediction, by the way, is a really useful learning activity as well, because when students try to do that, it activates their prior knowledge, they're making connections and so forth. And it also now, given that they've committed, they want to know the answer. When Eric Mazur was here about 7 or 8 years ago, he gave a presentation where he gave a problem to people, saying with a picture of a plate of metal, a sheet of metal with a hole in it. And he said, we know that as things heat up, they expand. What will happen to the size of the hole in this metal plate? And then he had people vote on it for faculty. We had a couple hundred faculty members there. And what happened is everyone was actively discussing it. Or first they voted. He said, vote on this without talking to anyone. Then he said, okay, now talk to people around you. Find someone with a different answer and try to convince them that your answer is better. And the volume got really loud, and there was really active discussion and engagement. And then he had people vote a second time. And he said, that's how he does this in his classes. He picks challenging questions where the answers may not be obvious, that are applications of the concepts they've been going over. And you notice how actively engaged you all were. And then he said, and now that's why I like to use clickers in my class. And he went on to the next topic, and people got really angry because he didn't tell them what the answer was. And that was, and he did that intentionally, because he wanted to show them, to show all of us why now that activity led to this increase in curiosity and engagement. And he said, if I was to lecture to you about what happens to the size of a hole in a plate of metal if I were to heat it up, it would be about the most boring topic you could imagine. And now you all want to know the answer. So that's a really powerful technique here. If you ask good questions that they're now curious about, it helps helps students make much better connections than they would otherwise. Now, what the research shows is that clicker use or polling use is most effective when you combine it with peer instruction and just-in-time teaching. A lot of instructors, when they first use polling, just simply ask students questions like quiz questions based on readings or other things they had done. But students like that and instructors like that because of that feedback aspect. But what they found is there was no significant increase in student learning. What was discovered first by Eric Mazur when he did this, and actually he did it out of frustration because he was doing this and he thought this was going to work. And he kept asking students questions about a problem that they kept getting wrong. And then he said, well, I've explained this to you many ways and it's not working. Why don't you try explaining it to each other? And they did, and the scores went up. So he's been advocating for about 20 years now, or 21 years now, using peer instruction as part of this. And the research is pretty strong that having students explain things and argue it amongst themselves tends to reinforce learning and tends to lead to significant learning gains. And also, providing feedback is essential. That just-in-time teaching aspect is when you see students are getting things wrong, it's a great time to provide some feedback and correction so that students are learning from the experience. Just discussing it themselves, where many of them may still be wrong, doesn't lead to quite as much of a gain as if you explain to them why some answers were wrong and some were correct, or have the students explain that. But providing feedback on the questions is really, really helpful. In one study that was done by a group of physicists, including Carl Wyman, they did a controlled experiment where they had essentially the equivalent classes. One set of classes used clickers and one didn't with this type of methodology. And they did a pre-test and a post-test on some particular concepts in chemistry. I forgot which ones it was. They're called concept tests that have been developed for this purpose. And they found that the learning gains were twice as large when compared to class with no clicker use. In this particular paper, they showed the distribution of the overall scores on that, and the whole distribution was shifted so that the bottom half of the bottom tail, the bottom 15, 20% overlap with the top 15 or 20% of the class that did not use this technique. So the whole distribution is shifted far over to the right with clicker use. And actually, I should also note Eric Mazur in one of his studies based on the force concept inventory in physics found learning gains of 300%, so that the gain in scores from the pre to the post-test scores were 3 times as large for the group that used clickers as for the group that did not in the classes. And also one question that initially came up is, does this gain persist? And so Crossgrove and Curran did a test where they had some classes that used clickers, some that didn't, and they tested the students a year later. And they found that the classes where students used clickers, in both classes, the scores dropped a bit from where they were administered at the end of the term. But a year later, the students who had used clickers ended up remembering more, significantly more, than those students in the classes that had not used this type of approach. So here, I'm just going to demonstrate a few questions. And this is a multiple choice question. And I open it up, I choose multiple choice, and I go from there. And I'm going to start the polling. And I'm going to close it so it's not displayed. So Jim, if you just want to pick A, B, or C, it doesn't really matter which one.
Okay.
And I'll see the response come in. So again, as the instructor, you can see the responses come in, and you could also do a countdown where you could give them, say, a minute and a half or a minute. Usually when I'm doing this in class, I set it to initially the beginning of the term, maybe a minute and a half, and I'll cut back to a minute and a quarter as students get more used to it. In smaller classes, I'll often drop it down to a minute, or I'll just cut it off when it goes off, and I'll click that, and I can now look at the response and see that you picked A. And in fact, that is a correct answer. So I'll click A, and that will show up now as a correct answer, and it'll be automatically graded that way in the grade book. Okay, and then I'll minimize this. So that's just an example where you can embed questions and ask them.
Yeah.
And now, and that graph would allow me now to explain it to students. And now here's another type of question, and this is a new feature that we didn't have before. It's this is a target response. So here, what will happen is you can just use a mouse and right click on any portion of the screen. And this could be used if you have maps or images or anything else. And let me start it, sorry. So now you should have the image there on your screen, Jim, and you should be able to just tap on the screen anywhere.
Okay.
Just, I think a mouse click somewhere on the screen.
Okay.
Okay, and that's come in, so I'll stop the polling. And now when I display it, what will happen is it will show you picked a dot right there, okay? And in fact, what's going to happen here is labor demand would go up. So what's going to happen is, how do I do this? Do I make this bigger? I did this before and it worked fine. I'm trying to figure out how to. Well, what should happen is oops, I didn't mean to do that. What should happen here is I've only used this once before. Here we go. Okay, I got it. So what you do is you pick the area where the correct answers are. So the correct answers would actually be right here. So it only gives you a rectangle as an option. So you want to make sure that the correct answer on the image is that. And I'll click save. And now, so your answer will be marked correct because it fell in that range. Okay. And so I'll close that up. And then other things that happens with clicker use is there's higher attendance, there's more participation. You know, I'm wandering around the class answering students' questions. They tend to ask more questions when they're working on these things. There's a nice video here. I'll share a link to this later, but I don't want to go too long on this. And in general, most people who've used clickers like using clickers, that they're likely, very few people will use polling devices and then stop unless there's something that interferes with them, such as a pandemic and if you were using the physical clicker. Now, there's a few things to avoid if you're going to use these, especially if students have to pay for them. One of the most annoying things that students report is some instructors have used clickers and had students pay for the use of clickers just to keep attendance. And students would often find it offensive to be asked to pay for something so that the instructor can keep track of whether they're there or not. You know, this is a really effective learning tool, and it should be phrased as that. It does increase attendance, and it does de facto provide a record of attendance, but the primary reason for it and the best reason to sell its use to students is that it increases their learning. And again, the evidence on that is pretty much overwhelming. If you're going to use clickers, don't do it just occasionally, especially if students have to buy them. You know, if they have to pay for a license or a subscription to the clicker or a physical clicker, if you're only going to use it once or twice in the course, that's a pretty high cost for a low level of usage. That in general, if you're going to do it, it's probably best to do it regularly, if not every day, at least maybe most days, or at least once or twice a week. In my large intro class, I generally would use it 10 and 12 times in the course of an hour and 20-minute class session. So I use it quite a bit in my classes, and students generally appreciate that. And that should read, do not penalize students for occasional absences. Students may forget their smartphone. They may have internet problems. They may have the doctor's appointment, a sports team travel thing, or something else. You know, one thing that most people do who use clickers, if they're grading them, is they tend to allow a certain number of drop scores. Typically, I'll drop 5 classes unless there is some sort of a network problem that interferes. So I'll drop the 5 lowest grades for the grade book, and I'll do this every day, which really is giving students 2.5 weeks, since the class meets twice a week, 2.5 weeks of missed scores. And if they're there every day, it'll just drop whatever days they got the lower scores on. But if they're, for any reason, they're not there, it makes it so much easier to deal with, because particularly if you have a class of hundreds of students, you don't want to have to deal with students saying, well, my battery went dead on my phone, or I had network problems that day, because you'll get dozens of such issues in larger classes, or they had, they were sick, or they had to go away for a funeral or a sporting event or a wedding. It's just easier to have a fixed policy that treats everyone fairly. It's more equitable too, because some students may miss class or not report it. And, in any case, usually people just allow a certain number of drops, and that's pretty easy to do in the grade book, just dropping a certain number of grades in that category, as long as you do it after. If you're going to drop 5 classes, you can't do that until you've had at least 6 days of classes, or it will drop all the scores. So I usually stagger it out, where in the first 20% of the semester, I'll drop 1. The 40th% of the way through, I'll drop a second, and drop the final one in the last week or so of the semester. What Eric Mazur suggests, and Derek Bruff and others who've studied this, that the most effective questions are the ones that somewhere around 40 to 60% of students, if there are correct answers, will answer correctly, because you want it to be challenging but not discouraging. You want students to have a good chance at it, but if most people are getting the question wrong, they're not going to learn very much from the pure discussion. If everyone is getting it right, they're not going to learn very much by working with the problem. You want challenging questions. And again, as I mentioned before, the most effective way of doing this is to first poll students, let them discuss it, and let them vote again. And almost always, you'll see, at least 99% of the time when I've done this, you'll see the scores go up on the second attempt after they've had a chance to explain things to each other. Another suggestion is, and that I've mentioned before too, is give some points for any answer, but more for the correct answer, so that the activity is challenging, but they're not losing much if they make a mistake. So it's low stakes. It's partly a participation activity. And if you're going to ask questions where half of them might be expected to get the questions wrong, you probably don't want the average score in this activity to be a 50%. So it'll bring the scores up. So if they get half of them wrong, they've got about an 80 or so, in a typical today's class, if they were there. And again, if you drop the lowest scores, that'll also bring it up some. And again, it's important to provide feedback, as I mentioned before. And here's a resource. This is kind of dated. I'll click on it, and I'll put it in the chat. We haven't had time the last couple of years to update this, but there are there is some information there that's more dated than it probably should be. It's just, there hasn't been much time the last couple of years, and certainly not during the past year. Okay, so that's my formal presentation, but what questions do you have?
I'm wondering, John, if I were using Zoom, but I had this app, basically they could use this on their phone.
Yes.
At the same time that I'm still engaged with them in the Zoom format.
Yes. And even if they're connecting to you on their phones, they could switch from one app to the other. I've had students doing that, so that they might be watching you in the Zoom app on their phone, and then they just flick it away and open the polling app when the question is active, and they'll see the question right on the screen. So they'll answer it, and then they'll switch over from that back to the Zoom app once the polling is done.
I see.
But yeah, ideally, I mean, the easiest thing is what you were just doing, that you could see the Zoom screen. Well, you would be switching back and forth, but if a student had the mobile app, they'd answer the question on there and see the question on the screen and the discussion.
Okay. Well, now on my screen right now, I have the clicker format. I don't have anything from Zoom. So,
It's still there if you were to minimize that screen.
okay. Now I don't have anything, I guess.
Then you should see at the bottom of the screen. I'm trying to show you, which won't work if you can't see it. There's that little that blue icon with the white video camera in the middle of it for Zoom. If you click on that, it should pop it back up.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
So, and when you finish class, what you would do is you would close this, and it's going to, no, that's not what I want to do. I'm going to go over here and close the app. There we go. And that's not closing the app. That's not the closing thing. Let me move that out of the way. This is new to me because I was using the new one. Here we go. This shows me who's active in it right now, which students. This lets me do the quiz. This lets me, this would activate a quiz where you can set up a quiz to be used asynchronously if you wanted to do that. But now I'm going to close this, which would end the class session. But the interesting thing is this is already set up by default with an exit poll. And that just will be asking participants what questions they still have and so forth. So it's an exit ticket that is kind of automatic. And I may have accidentally just clicked out of it. You have the option of doing that or not. So at the end of the class, it will ask students what questions they're still having questions with, or you don't have to do that, but it's there as an option by default. Let me just restart that again so we can see it. This will be a new class session. Now I'm going to close it. And now I'm going to end class with the exit poll. And there you go. And it's in progress. So what will happen is, the students would see questions asking them what questions they still have, what do they find confusing, and so forth. And then you can use that at the start of next class to address any concepts from that.
Wow. Wow. Oh, that's good.
And you also have the question of doing polls anonymously if you're going to ask students questions that may be sensitive. And certainly in psychology, for example, you might have some questions that you don't want to, have graded or know which students responded to. But, I've really enjoyed it. And I think most people who've tried using these polling tools have found it helpful. There's many options, but at any given campus, there's a lot of advantages to just using one across the campus, because that way, I should mention the cost. If you only use multiple choice questions, students can use the physical clickers, which they can get a new one for $45 and use it in every class throughout their entire time on campus, or they can buy a used one, which sells for about $20 to $25 on Amazon or in the campus bookstore. And once they have that, they can use it in any number of classes. But then you're limiting yourself to only multiple choice questions, and they only work if you're in a physical classroom. So if students cannot attend in person, they won't be able to use the radio frequency clicker. Because it works by essentially radio frequencies that are limited to about 200 meters or so. So they have to be either in the room or within the building or very near the building to be able to answer questions using a physical clicker. With a mobile app, they could be anywhere. Although I should note that one feature they built into this in the past year is geofencing. So if you don't want students to participate, if they're not in the classroom or at least in the classroom building, you can turn that on, and students will not be able to participate if they're in their dorm room or if they're at home. And yes, you can have students answer questions on computers in a face-to-face class. And that's one of the issues that I know one of our colleagues, in fact, in the music department, uses this in an intro music class with 1 to 200 students, and he only allows them to use the physical clickers. He doesn't allow them to use the mobile app because he has a device ban. He doesn't allow them to use mobile phones or laptops. And yes, it could very well lead to students using their mobile devices for other things or their laptop. However, you always have the option of telling students, you know, we're going to be working on these things now, put your phones away. Or now pick up your phone and we're going to do a clicker question. So they will be looking at their phone or their computer screen when you're doing the clickers, but they don't have to be using it for other things. So students do get distracted by mobile devices, as we all do, perhaps at times, but that is an issue, and that is a factor that people do take into account in terms of whether to use a physical clicking device that only has the 5 buttons on it, A, B, C, D, or E, and will not allow them to check their email or to look at baseball games and so on. So
if I were using something like this, John, my questions and so on would all be part of my preparation.
yes.
And if I'm going to use it 10, 12 times during the class period, you know, just as for example's sake, I have a presentation for a particular class.
Mm-hmm.
And next class, you know, I follow a similar routine, but this becomes an aid for me in terms of engaging, securing participation, monitoring their activity, and so on. So when I have begun my class session and I have everybody checked in, and I want this to come into play, how do I access it or bring it on board?
It works from a program, and you just go down on your computer, and I'm assuming they'll set this up on computers in the classroom, but it's iClicker Cloud. You go down to it, you just click on that, and then you would log in. Mine is set up to automatically log in. If it's in the classroom, you'd have to log in with the same credentials that you just created, except as an instructor. And then, because you saw there was something, it popped up saying iClicker sign in. Mine is already set to save my credentials, but what would happen otherwise is I could sign out and then sign back in and then start the class. And it would show me all my classes. When you create a class session, it's created by date. So you only the ones that are active during that time interval would show up. If in let's say a typical semester, I might have 2 classes where I'm using clickers, and it would show both of those. And I just click on whichever one and click on start class. And that puts up that little tool on the screen right here, which is used to actually start the quizzes. And by clicking it, you can minimize it, or you can, you can click on, oops, I didn't mean to do that. Do not end. That was a mistake. There we go. You click on it and it minimizes, or you click on it again and it gives you the option. So, and you have the polling options, and you can see all of the options there for multiple choice, short answer, numeric. The target one, where you have a portion of the screen that has a correct answer, or multiple answers where you could have, it's like a multiple select where choose all the correct responses and so forth. And then you just use, and then you click on this green button to start the polling. And then when you want to see the results, you click on this and it will show a histogram with the results. Or if it was a free response, it would show the list of results. If it was a target one, it would show a graph of all the points on the screen. Now, if you have hundreds of students, it's just going to look like a green blur. But you draw that, you choose that range of correct answers, and then it will mark all those that fall within that boundary as the correct answers. Or you don't have to have it, choose correct answers. You could just have students respond. And one way in which some people will do this is they'll ask students a question. They'll get the responses either anonymously or with names, and then they'll discuss a topic, and then they'll have them vote again to see how opinions change from the beginning to the end of the class period, and talk about why their opinions change as a result of that discussion. So it can be used to help prompt discussions as well. It doesn't have to be used, to assess knowledge in some way. It can be used to assess preconceptions, or, think about what types of things what type of biases students might have about a topic beforehand. And you can use that perhaps to adjust how you present the material and so on. So
the preparation of the slides for a particular class is basically similar to developing a PowerPoint.
Exactly. You just put the questions in here, and what happens is when you activate the question, it does a screen grab of whatever's on the screen. So whatever is appearing to students on the screen ends up being saved in here as the question that you asked. So you don't have to do anything other than open the app and it will grab this. If you wanted to, you could open a Word document. One of our faculty who actually left recently, but one person was doing this where he would just open up a notepad document and type the question right on that. And that became the basis of his discussion, of his question. So whatever is appearing on the screen, so it's agnostic, whether you use PowerPoint, Google Slides, Prezi, or even if you just want to open a Word document or something, anything that's on the screen will be captured as the question.
Okay. Okay. This is kind of off the topic probably, but on Zoom, there is a feature for polling.
There is.
Okay.
It's limited. It works, but you have to write the questions in advance. And if you wanted to grade it, it's really difficult to get the responses back. You can see individual responses, but you have to dig into it, and it's downloaded as a spreadsheet, and it only works if everyone's registered. If you just want to do a poll and you don't care who answered which question, and if you're not going to grade it, that will work, but you have to create the questions in advance in Zoom. You can't do it very easily on the fly.
Okay. Okay.
So what I like about this could work in person. It could work over Zoom. It can work in any modality.
It's great. Great. Thank you, John.
You're welcome. Janet, do you have any questions? Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.